Well, I was going to make a joke about what Jesus said about those who sit out the end table and they'll tell me, come on up to the front. But then all these guys started flocking up here. So I thought, well, he also told those of us who sit at the front to go to the back, So no, we don't want to do that. So anyway, I need to go to the back first and foremost. I'm going to start with a prayer from St. Sophrony the Athonite. Come and abide in us, thou all good King and Lord, and dwell in us unceasingly and inseparably, both in this life and at our departure, that we too may dwell with thee and reign with thee, God, who art being above all other. Amen. That's from his book, The Mystery of Christian Life. I want to talk about, over the coming weeks, some saints, but I want you to see it from a different perspective when we normally think of saints, as the way we need to look at them. Saint Sophrony, in the same book that I just had that prayer, describes the Christian life this way. He says it's above national ways of thinking, above patriotism and other such limitations. This is without any rejection of the reality of our temporal existence or disdain towards it. So it's something, the culture, if you will, of Christianity is something above and beyond everything we can imagine. We tend to describe, we fallen human beings tend to describe others by culture, by race, by color, by nationality, by ethnicity. And we often use the word culture. It's real popular in modern terminology, so I'm sort of using it, and I guess I'll be using it the way we do it in the modern age. But we tend to classify everybody else who's different than we are. And a lot of our designations are just inadequate. For example, we designate by color, and this is called white, right? But this is white. So see how that doesn't work? And all our designations are like that. It's interesting, but all the colors that we see in other people are variations of earth tones. And it's very interesting that earth, one of the earliest Hebrew words for earth was Adamah, from which we get the word Adam, if you didn't recognize it in there. And so we would agree that we're all descended from Adam, and hence from Adamah. So the colors and the distinctions don't make any difference, but that's a part of our earthly culture to do that. I had a friend I worked with many years ago, and he was black. And he and I would have long discussions about all kinds of things. And one day we realized in the conversation that when I spoke of anyone that was different than I always qualified that person. And when he spoke with anyone who was different than he did the same. So I wouldn't mention a white guy when I was talking about a white guy, but he would, and he wouldn't mention a black guy when he was talking about someone who was black. And we realized in that we see people as other than ourselves. And that colors the way we even define them. So culture, we tend to view all the world from our own cultures. So here in the United States, the American culture, whatever that is. So let's define the word culture, if we may. It's worldly propensities and the worldly propensities and activities of a particular nation or people, the morals, the values, the mores, the religious persuasions. Notice how the religions that we think of as being reflective of certain parts of the world. Perceptions of reality. Limited self-awareness. We judge all the world. That movie, The Last of the Mohegans, with Daniel Day-Lewis, the English officer says to the commanding officer, I thought our goal was to make all the world England. So that's the way we want to make all the world America. And it doesn't work that way. And people resent us for it. But that's a worldly way of looking at the concept of culture. And we often view, as I mentioned, our own group as the center of all human reality. I find it interesting that among many of the tribes of the American Plains Indians, the word, even though they're from different language groups, almost all these different tribes or peoples define themselves with a word that gets translated the people or the real human beings. That's part of the fallen notion of culture. That's the way we look at it, even though we would never, I'm not like that. Sure we are. Sure we are. And in the United States, it's interesting. All these different cultures from around the world begin to merge, and a new culture is born, but it's still a culture. Perhaps the best on earth, but it's still a culture, and it's still limited. And then in contrast to that is the church's culture. And we have our own culture in the church, and I think we heard some of it today in the service, in the liturgy. For example, part of the church's culture, and by that I mean, I don't mean Christianity in general. I mean the church, the Orthodox church throughout the world. When I talk about the church, that's what I'm talking about. This is a modern notion that every time somebody breaks off and starts his own place, the definition of the church broadens. It doesn't. It stays the same. And the church's culture has included, no matter where you go, when you go to an Orthodox church, you will find images of the Blessed Virgin Mary. And if we come out of a culture that is predominantly motivated and qualified and understood in the context of American Protestantism, then we're going to think there's something wrong with that. I always think about some of the Eastern Rite churches. You go in there and, where we have the Christus Rex, the big cross with Christ in his vestments and resurrection form, where we have that, they often have an image of the Blessed Virgin sitting with the Christ child in her lap, and her hands are out like this. And if we don't know any better, we'll go in there and say, oh, look at these people. I could have told you, they've supplanted Jesus with the Mother of God or the Blessed Virgin. Well, that's not true. She's an image of us, the way we're supposed to be. And when we walk into an Orthodox church and we see this, our cultural understanding is apt to color the way we view it. So if we had our way, we'll tell that priest, by God, get that image down and put an empty cross up there. Says who? And think about this. If she represents us and she's holding Christ, what does that say about us? We have been glorified in Christ. Now we have to live up to this. Wow. Big order. So the church has its own culture, and no matter where we go, we'll find out. We all want to have the liturgy in the language that we speak as our first language. But we also learn in the church, part of the church's culture is to learn to worship with all of one's senses. And there's a reason for this. Once we learn to do that, and for example, we learn the basic qualities of a Mass, we do not have to have it in our own language. It's nice, but we don't have to have that. We can go into an Orthodox church where the whole service is in Greek or Russian and we know what's going on. Some of you are nodding because you've been there and done that. It's because we learn to worship with our senses. We learn to worship the way we've begun to learn the culture of the church, is to learn something that transcends and goes beyond. And that culture is manifested to us in so many ways. We have, as we saw today, the calendar. And the world over, Orthodox churches are commemorating the Nativity of the Blessed Virgin today. Today. Eastern Rite, Western Rite, African, Indian, Chinese, wherever. They're doing the same thing. That's a part of the culture. A calendar is a part of the culture. I remember years ago, Bishop Basil came to visit our parish, and we had him over to our house for dinner, and the parish council with him. And afterwards, we had all this discussion going on. And afterwards, someone in the parish council, the president of the parish council said, you know, I've noticed something about Bishop Basil. He relates everything to the calendar. And I thought, that is very interesting. I hadn't thought about that. I mean, if you mentioned a date, he could tell you what saints were commemorated on that day. And he saw it that way. And what I realize now, after all these years, and that was almost 30 years ago, that that the calendar really, it comes out in us as we grow in this culture of the church. We begin to think along the terms of the calendar. We begin to live according to the principles of the calendar. Now, this is not a class on the calendar, but we're going somewhere with this. There are three aspects of calendar. You need to understand this in the culture of understanding the culture of the church. The one is the universal calendar, the one that we all celebrate together. We all have the major feasts, major fasts. When we're in Lent, we're all in Lent. Then there are regional calendars, usually based upon the Latin tradition or the Greek tradition, and they're more generalized. So if you pick up, sometimes the bookstore will have Eastern Rite calendars. They're based upon the Byzantine tradition, and they may have saints in there in schedules of events that you don't recognize because we're a Western Rite parish, and vice versa. So we have the regional version of it, and then we have the local versions. The local versions are like the Vicariate, the United States, any country on the continent of Africa, for example. So we have the local versions, and they all have their own saints. There are saints in the Irish calendar that we've never heard of. Even the English haven't heard of them. I love it. That's great. We don't want them to hear about that. Anyway, that's cultural, okay? That's worldly cultural I'm talking about. Okay, so in any case, I remember when I was first looking at coming into Orthodoxy, I had a meeting with an Orthodox bishop who was an immigrant from Lebanon. And in our discussions, I mentioned a Celtic saint, and he said, I don't know who that is. And I was surprised because I thought I was very ethnocentric. Everybody knows about the Celtic saints, of course. I didn't know anything about the calendar of Orthodoxy this way. Well, as it turns out, a few years later, another bishop wrote a book on the saints of the Middle East. And he had printed copies and had them sent to all the clergy in the archdiocese. So I get this book and I think, oh, this is great. And I opened it up, I didn't recognize any of them. I didn't know who they were. I was, what? It could be anybody. All these saints, and I'd never even heard of them. And this is true wherever we go in the world. So if you go to South Africa, for example, that's about as far as away we can get, or Beijing, we'll have saints that are celebrated and commemorated we've never even heard of. And yet they're all ours. So we have the local calendar. We have the music of the church, the chanting, which is usually based upon Gregorian, Latin, or Byzantine chanting. And everything is a variation on those. And really, those two forms of chant in the church stem from Jewish chant, which stems from the Middle East, the ancient Middle East, so it goes way, way back, with religious connotations, deep connotations. There's a message in the music. And that's a part that we learn. So we don't have to go and recreate every generation new music for the church. We can, I guess, but we don't have to. We need to learn what's there because it's a part of the tradition. I remember when I was ordained the diaconate in Cleveland, and I was sent up there. At the time, that's how they used to do it 30 years ago in this archdiocese. Now the bishops come to our parishes and do that, but we had to go off somewhere. So I was ordained to the diaconate in Cleveland and the priesthood in Los Angeles, to give you an idea. And I'm a Texas boy, so I don't want to go out them places. You know. So in any case, that's cultural too, by the way. So in any case, I got in this parish, which was a parish of Arabic immigrants. So they did the whole service in Arabic. And I went to, the ordination was on Sunday morning, so I went to Saturday Vespers. And they were chanting the whole thing in Arabic. And it was an Arabic version of Byzantine chant. That much I recognized. But what got me was that and the fact that they were loving what they did. The chanters were joyous. And they were smiling and they were singing in competition with one another, not in a sinful competition, but trying to bless the Lord, outdo one another in blessing God. And I thought, this is where I belong. And I thought, where did I come from? An American church which did everything in English and which I was familiar since I'd grown up with it. And here this was all strange to me in a sense, and yet it wasn't strange at all. I'd walked into the culture of the church. Well, then there are things like ordained clergy. You know, that we're not clergy unless we're ordained into the apostolic succession by bishops who themselves were ordained into the apostolic succession. So I don't get to start a church just because I feel like it, or I think I know better than this guy, and therefore I get to decide what's right and what's wrong. It doesn't work that way. And the definition of church does not expand every time one of us does that. This is the culture of the church. And so we are entering into a greater culture. And the saints of the church understood this, no matter where they were. They grasped this in some way. So when we look at the lives of the saints, we are looking at people who tell us what the culture of the church is and try to assist us in allowing ourselves to be drawn into it. Saint Sophrony, in his book, We Shall See Him As He Is, says, the mind of the Christian is totally directed toward the sphere of divine eternity. And I just finished reading, I like to read secular books too, in case you're thinking I'm all focused in one way. But I reread a book that was in my library called The Splendor That Was Egypt, and it was a 1963 publication of Egyptian findings by archaeologists. And the author was criticizing some of the archaeologists and their ethnocentric perspectives. And she described it as them as having a genius for misunderstanding anything outside the narrow limits of their own small countries. And I thought that's the secular culture. And the culture into which we are coming extends beyond all of that. Saint Sophrony in that same book says it's impossible not to respect such a culture, but we must forget that it's meant for those whose feet are firmly rooted in the earth's crust. So when we look at the Western Rite calendar, the calendar that the parish will have, and we look at the saints in it, we're going to find another. Well, this is interesting because it wasn't until I started putting this class together that I realized this and recognized it. We'll realize that a number of saints in this calendar are from various parts of the world. They're not all from the same place that I come from. If they would all be Celtic saints. But they're not. So the culture of the church includes everybody. So when you look at it, for example, you have Jewish saints in the Western Rite calendar. You have Middle Eastern saints in the Western Rite calendar. All the apostles and people in the New Testament, by the way, were Jewish. St. Paul said the gospel comes to the Jew first and then to the Gentile. So there they are. We have African saints in the Western Rite calendar. We don't know that. And yet, let's think of this, and maybe you'll pick up some other patterns here. I'm going to name some names for you. These are African saints in our calendar. St. Paul the First Hermit, St. Anthony the Great, St. John the Almoner, St. Mary of Egypt, St. Athanasius the Great, St. Monica, mother of St. Augustine, St. Pachomius, the founder of Cenobitic monasticism, St. Paphnutius of Egypt, one of my favorites, St. Cyprian of Carthage, many of you may have read of St. Cyprian, Saints Maurice and Companions, the Theban Legion, Saint Cyril of Alexandria, Saints Perpetua and Felicity, Saint John Climacus, Saint Menna of Egypt, Saint Catherine of Alexandria, Saint Peter of Alexandria, Saint Moses of Ethiopia, Saint Augustine of Hippo, to name just some. All from, and yeah, that's from North Africa, and there were Semites that mixed in with their bloodlines, but I was reading the other day, one scholar suggested that St. Augustine may have been half Berber and half Punic from Phoenician. So if you look at the Ethiopian icons, St. Cyprian will come out with very dark skin, and many of these people will. So we can't say, well, they're Europeans. Well, that's nonsense. Remember, I said this in a lesson I taught at the Paris Life Conference a few years ago. We errantly think that Christianity is a European religion. It's a Semitic religion which came to us via the Arabs, via North Africa, via the Latin tradition. The Latin tradition emerges out of North Africa. The first Latin liturgies were done in North Africa. So it transcends those limitations. And we mustn't go there. There are Greek saints in the calendar. There are saints of Asia Minor who were primarily Greek-speaking in the calendar. There are Celtic saints in the calendar. And I'm going to address one of them at least that I really think tells us something that we need to know. There are saints of North America in our calendar. And what I like about the ones in North America is they really fit the whole scenario of what North American culture is, because every one of them is an immigrant, with one exception. And if the anthropologists are correct, the one exception is American Indian, and the American Indians are descendants of immigrants from Mongolia, if the anthropologists are correct. So if that's correct, the only Native Americans are those who were born here, which is probably nearly everybody in this room. In any case, nonetheless, St. John Maximovich, St. Innocent of Alaska, St. Juvenali, St. Raphael of Brooklyn, St. Tikhon of Moscow, St. Alexis Toth, St. Herman of Alaska. St. Peter, the Aleut, is the one that I was thinking of that was born in Alaska. So the goal of this series of classes is to review a number of saints' biographies, to see what cultures we are touched by the church, and to identify the saints that they have produced. It's important that we see this, so that we are drawn into the greater culture of the church. Each saint rises from the cultural level of understanding to a higher level, and they bring that to us. And we want from that then to glean further qualities of the church's culture and how we can participate in that. So I want you to see more broadly when you see. I used to read the saints thinking, oh, they're just showing me how to get to Christ. Well, yeah, but it's broader than that. It involves everything, every aspect of our beings. So I'm going to start with a Jewish saint. You may or may not have heard of him, St. Simeon of Jerusalem. He was a bishop and a martyr. He was born, I want you to hear this because this is critical. He was born in 10 BC, so they say, and died, we think, in 107. Did you get those dates? 107 AD? So in other words, he was probably around 110 when he died. So he's a saint for the aged. And if you live long enough, you're going there, I guarantee you. So that's another thing about the culture of the saints is that we can't say, well, I'm a child and I need a saint who's a child. Well, we don't stay children for long if we live long lives or full lives. We become adults. But if those saints have transcended the secular culture and present to us the living culture of God, then their witness is pertinent no matter what age they are, no matter what age we are. So in any case, St. Simeon, born around 10 BC, it's believed he was the son of Clopas of gospel fame. Clopas was believed to be the brother of St. Joseph, which would make Simeon, through the marriage of St. Joseph, a cousin of the Lord. In the earliest years of the church in Judea, Simeon was a presbyter under the authority of St. James of Jerusalem and assisted St. James in the administration of the Jerusalem church, about which we read in Acts a lot. When James was martyred in the early 60s, St. Simeon was elected to replace him as bishop of that church, probably because the people knew him and he was Jewish and he was into the family, so to speak, in more ways than one. And he'd been around as an authority in the church, an administrator. So being Jewish, he worked long and hard he focused on conversion of the Jewish people in Jerusalem area, in Judean area. In fact, he and the Jerusalem church did convert many, and many of the people who were converts out of that area in that time frame, in the latter part of the first century, were brought into the church by virtue of his ministrations. He was a pastor of that church for over 40 years. Can you believe that? When he died, how hard it must have been to replace him or to get used to the fact that he wasn't around anymore. remember as an Anglican, we used to have an old saying that I think I've said this before, that the Protestants have the inerrancy of the Bible, the Romans have the infallibility of the Pope, and the Anglicans have the authority of the former rector. So we used to joke about it, but that actually is a joke that goes farther. It's like that in all kinds of parishes. They're like that. The former rector, they may have hated him, the parish may have hated him, but the minute he's gone, he's God incarnate. And so then his father so-and-so never did it that way. Well, that has nothing to do with any of that. In any case, in 107, during Trajan's allowance of persecution, I put in my notes during the Trajan persecution, but there wasn't any formal persecution in Trajan. He just allowed certain things to happen. Simeon was denounced before the Roman magistrates. He was accused of being guilty of being a Christian, and that was that he was holding the view that this Christianity was the only way to unity with God. That's a part of the culture of the church. Jesus said it. I am the way, the truth, and life. No one comes to the Father but by me. We just have to get that through our heads. We don't like that in American culture because that goes contrary to American culture. But it also goes contrary to say it's wrong, goes contrary to the culture of the church and the culture of the faith. So in any case, he was around 110 to 120 at the time he was arrested. They tortured him because they figured a guy of his stamina would break easily at his age. It was said that he was so thin, some sources say that you could, when he held his hands up in the orange position at Mass, if he had the light the right way, you could see through his hands. That means there's no muscle tissue in there at all. It's just sinew and bones and skin. So his stamina, he lived up to what the Romans tried to apply. And finally, they crucified him when they got frustrated. The Romans got frustrated with Christians who were defiant very quickly. And so they wound up killing them off as quickly as they could if they decided to do that. So his last words were a prayer of thanksgiving that he was able to die for his Lord. He gave up his life on the 27th of April, sometime between the years of 107 and 110. Now, what I said is he's a saint for the elderly, but for everybody. And for the elderly, this is important because it sends a message that applies to all of us, and we have to remember this now. Being faithful means we go to the end of our lives. We don't retire from Christianity. I remember when I retired from active ministry, I had to write a letter to the Metropolitan requesting his blessing. And he gave it, but then he promptly reminded me, you as a priest will never really retire. Don't forget that you are always a priest until you can't get up to that altar again. That's more or less what he said.
He told me to put you to work.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. So we don't retire from the Christian life. We never will. Our circumstances may change, but we don't retire. We think of it in terms of we will retire. So once I used to have a really regimented prayer discipline based upon my showing up in the parish building. And when I retired, that was gone and we moved away. So I didn't have that anymore. And what I found was one of the first things that seemed to go by the wayside was my prayer time. So I had to reorganize because I had to keep praying. That was important. That's important for all of us. It's a part of our culture. So I had to adapt my life to that one in order to make it work. And then when we came over here, I had to do that again. That's okay. That's a reality. That's a part of my ministry. And we learn to adapt. That learning to adapt is a part of the culture. Also, I tell people when they have families, remember, if we're married and have families where there's an order, God first, spouse second, children third, job fourth. Must always be that order. That's God's order. That's the culture of the church. And someone will say, well, I don't know how I'm going to do that. I don't have time to divide all four ways. Well, God's order says make time. And we say, well, I'll give 95% to my job, or I'll give 95% to God, and I'll give 4% to my wife, and 1% to my children and my job. Well, no, 100% to all. That's a part of the culture. Do it, and God makes the time work. Try something else, failure is apt to happen. We can learn this kind of thing from Saint Simeon, who stayed with it and showed us that. And all the saints are like this. Now, the next time, I think I'll look at Saint Cyril of Jerusalem, some of the Middle Eastern saints, Saint Jerome of Bethlehem, and one of my favorites, because he liked to run from God, I think, Saint Hilarion. It's one of my favorites. I want to run from God, okay? So it's all I can do to hang on around here and do this job. So you know what you're dealing with. Look on his face. Yeah, I've been dealing with this for a while. In any case, thank you. That's it. When you read the saints, just remember these things.
That was wonderful. Thank you very much.